because I don't know why the video doesn't want to work. So we're just going to run through some background, some history real quick. Okay, so we've moved from Congress, we're now moving into the presidency. This will be the second half of the information that will show up on your test on Wednesday. Not tomorrow, but the Wednesday after break. Yeah, you looked a little confused there. No, Wednesday after break. All right. Understand that with the Constitution, and there were issues in terms of how we were going to establish a presidency or a national executive. Under the Articles of Confederation, did we have a president?
Yes.
No.
No.
There was no executive under the Articles of Confederation. Okay? It's one of the things that made the Articles of Confederation incredibly weak. Okay? The other being that the 13 colonies, or the 13 states at that point, they had to have 100% agreement to enact anything, and that never works. You never get 100% of the people to do anything. All right? So we know that we have a president today that has 4-year terms. All right? That was not the only option. When you look at it, some people wanted multiple presidents. They wanted like a council of presidents. Some people wanted president for life. Some people wanted president for 1 year. Right? And every single year we would have a new presidential election. Could you imagine that today? That would be ridiculously terrible. We start campaigning for president like 2 years before the actual election. Alright? Obviously we had fear of an excessively strong president or a tyrannical president. We know that that fear of tyranny is a commonly held belief in the foundation of the United States. Alright? Because there were a lot of people that kind of assumed that the president would basically be an elected king, like the King of England, and he would be terrible and do things that were detrimental to the welfare of the United States. There's also a fear that a weak president or a weaker executive would basically just get played by the Senate, and the Senate would be able to control him. And that goes into some of those checks and balances aspects, because the Senate does get to confirm treaties and appointments and things like that, right? So we have to have some sort of balancing power, all right, in what we want to do. We also have issues over how he was going to be elected. Obviously, we know about that, popular vote versus indirect democracy or whatever. One of the things that we come up with, the compromise becomes the Electoral College, all right? That's because we do not want the masses actually being able to pick the President of the United States, because they might vote for some uneducated demagogue who has no clue what he's actually doing in life. I'm not making that up. That's a real fear that they had. This is not a knock on Trump. Okay? But in all honesty, the Founding Fathers were afraid of somebody like Donald Trump. Okay? Again, you never know. Trump might turn out to be phenomenal. Let's cross our fingers and hope that he is our president. Right? But the whole idea of the Electoral College was so that the masses didn't vote for somebody that they didn't really understand, that just sort of whipped the common people into a frenzy because they were a good speaker and they had all the best words and whatnot. And that's an actual Donald Trump quote. I have all the best words. He said that. So the Electoral College becomes the compromise. We've talked about the Electoral College before. Realize that the way the Electoral College is ultimately supposed to work, theoretically, when we created the Constitution, there's supposed to be more than 2 individuals running for President of the United States, in which case nobody would get a majority in the Electoral College, and it would go to the House of Representatives, and one vote from each state would occur. And if you ended up in a state like Texas that had 36 votes, and of those 36 representatives, that's what I was trying to say. Right, 36 representatives. If the representatives tied 18-18, then Texas doesn't vote, period. They abstain. And which gives the small states a great amount of advantage here. Initially, initially. Let's talk about today. How long can you be president of the United States? 10 years. 10 years is the maximum amount of time that you can be president of the United States. Okay? This is a constitutional amendment. You can only be president for up to 10 years. It's actually 1 day less than 10 years. Okay? The only way that that happens is if you're the vice president of the United States and you take over in just after halfway through of somebody else's term, you serve out their term and then you're elected twice yourself. Right? If you serve more than half of their term, then it counts as your term and you're only allowed to be elected once. Understood? Okay, so Truman, for instance, okay, was only elected, or could only have been elected one time under the current deal, because Truman took over for FDR more than halfway through FDR's 4th term. FDR was elected president 4 times, okay, because that did not exist prior to FDR. Right? There's no provisions in the initial Constitution to determine how long or how many terms of office a president can have. Okay? This is why, and you've heard me use this term before, the term precedent is so important. How many terms did Washington serve? 2. And that sets a precedent. And forever and ever, up until FDR, because FDR is the only one. Because of that precedent, nobody served more than 2 terms. And in fact, Teddy Roosevelt served 2 terms and then he voluntarily left, picked his successor. His successor didn't do a very good job, so he came back and ran a 3rd time to try to get that guy out of office. All right? But for, 150 years? Right? Roughly 150 years. 2 terms and that was it. All right? All based on a precedent. Okay? Now, here's the other thing that you need to understand about the evolution of presidents. When we look at our initial presidents, and we'll take the first 5, because the first 5 presidents are founding fathers. Do we know that? Right? Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. Those 5 guys were founding fathers. The first one who was not a founding father is John Quincy Adams, 6th president, John Adams' son. All right? So he was a little boy during the Revolution. Okay? The other 5 are founding fathers. If we look at those 5 men, do we notice anything similar about them? Can we categorize them in any ways? I mean, other than them all being white men? Are there any other similarities that we could group them all together with? They're all wealthy for the most part, comparatively, yeah. Where are they from?
Oh, like, isn't it like Virginia or something?
4 of those 5 men are all from Virginia. Okay? 4 of the 5 guys are from Virginia. And so, when we are founded, we do have some issues. Believe it or not, their secession talks all the way back in the early 1800s because New England states think that they're going to be dominated by southern states forever because southern states have the higher population because of slavery and the need for significant amounts of labor down south because of farming, right? There are actually people that argue that the South, or that the North, should secede from the Union. 50, 60 years before the Civil War actually occurs. So understand that there are some issues about all of this, right? Additionally, we have some aspects of the original presidency. It's supposed to be relatively modest. They're not supposed to overexert themselves too much. We rely on Washington and his sort of precedent for a large part of things. Washington doesn't want us to have permanent treaties. We try to stay away from that. Washington warns against parties, although they end up becoming inevitable and they're not really avoidable, right? But for the most part, our presidents are a little subdued, right? They're strong figureheads, but they don't go out and try to exert power at the expense of other branches of government. And that's really true up until Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson's the guy who, for the first time, sort of changes the idea of the presidency. Okay, one, Andrew Jackson is really the first president to ever campaign to be president of the United States. Okay, prior to that point, it was literally other like learned officials who came and they were like, "Hey, we really want you to be president." Right, and then whoever they asked to be president, that person would be like, "No, no, you don't need me." Like they would just pretend like they were being humble. Okay, so obviously they wanted the job, but they'd have that like immodest humility. And like, no, you can find somebody better. And that's how it always worked up until Jackson. Okay? And in fact, the only person that ever really successfully said no was Washington. They tried to get him to run a third time. And Washington, because he was so intelligent, realized that if he continued to serve basically until his death, that he would set a precedent for a president for life. He didn't want that. All right? But Jackson's going to vastly expand the power of the presidency. Okay? He's going to even go so far as there's a Supreme Court case, Worcester versus Georgia, in which a Native American tribe sues for the right to stay on their land. The Supreme Court sides with the Native American tribe. Andrew Jackson takes his little army down there and says, "Yeah, what are you going to do? I'm going to kick you off the land anyways." Basically tells the Supreme Court, stop it.
Didn't he say like so-and-so made his decision, now let him enforce it?
Yeah. Yeah, Marshall made his decision, now let him enforce it. Okay? After Jackson gets out, Congress is going to try to reestablish its power. And it's really not until Lincoln. In fact, can you name a president between Jackson and Lincoln? Like, without looking at my little chart here. Can you name a president between Jackson and Lincoln?
Zachary Taylor.
Who?
Zachary Taylor.
Zachary Taylor? Yeah, he's one.
James Garrett. Right?
James K. Polk. You should know Polk. Polk's an awesome president. He went to UNC.
Oh my God.
But hey, listen, in all honesty, and the reason, look, most people, most learned, educated people in the United States, I bet you that if you went to, I mean, take like a world geo teacher, right? Somebody that probably has a degree in history. I bet you they couldn't, off the top of their head, name a president between Jackson and Lincoln. Because Congress, after Jackson sort of takes all this power, Congress comes back and takes it back after Jackson gets out of office. All right? Because they didn't like that sort of idea. All right? That exists all the way up until Lincoln. Lincoln reestablishes the power of the presidency somewhat because Lincoln obviously extends his power in order to save the Union. And in fact, right before Lincoln, was it right before Lincoln? Yeah, Buchanan, right before Lincoln, literally the president for 4 years before Abraham Lincoln becomes president, basically looked at the South and said, "You want to leave, I'm not going to stop you." Okay? Because he didn't think he had that authority. He didn't think he had that power. Lincoln believed that he did. All right? So for a significant amount of time, Congress takes the lead again. That lasts up until FDR. And we've talked about this before. FDR is that massive change in American government. All right? So FDR will, again, increase the power of the presidency. All right? And so FDR is the one who sort of starts this ideology the first 100 days. He gets a significant amount of legislation passed at that point. All right? And he's the one that begins to make the president sort of the central figure in American government, right? And we've talked about this now today. The president is the one in this culture, in our mindset today, right? When things go well, we give the president credit. When things go poorly, we blame the president, right? Now that president is sort of at the beginning of everything. All right? We do have a history of increasing presidential power in times of crises. So whether it's the Great Depression, where we let FDR get away with a lot more, or periods of time of war, we allow presidents to exert more power. Okay? Sometimes it's actually detrimental when you look at LBJ and the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and basically the President of the United States putting us in a war that most Americans believe today we probably shouldn't have been in the first place. All right. So real quick, our overview for president, and we'll stop. And we talked about the overview for the terms for Congress. Representative was 25 years old, 7 years a resident. Goes up to 30 years old, 9 years a resident for Senate. 35 years old, 14 years a resident for President of the United States. Only other qualification with the President of the United States, you have to be a natural born citizen. What does that mean?
Born in America.
Does it mean born in America?
Born on American soil.
Born on American soil. So, Senator Ted Cruz was born where? Canada. On Canadian soil. He ran for President of the United States. Was he eligible?
No. Isn't it like if you're born on American soil to American citizens, or on like a U.S. base?
Well, the U.S. base would classify as American soil. Like, we count that as American soil. U.S. Embassy would be the same way.
Yeah.
Right? So that's the thing. What Laura just said, there are a lot of people, and there's never been a Supreme Court decision. Laura, sorry. What Laura just said. There's never been a Supreme Court decision that makes a decision about this one way or the other. So it's really hard to determine what the actual outcome would be. But a lot of people do believe what she just said. Natural born citizen means born to an American. Meaning that the minute you take your first breath in the world, you would classify as an American. That would be true of Ted Cruz. His mom was a U.S. citizen. All right? 4-year term of office, maximum of 2 years or 2 terms. That comes from the 22nd Amendment. Relatively easy to remember, right? 22, 2 terms. Okay, 22 is 2 terms. We just talked about this. You can serve for up to 10 years if it results as it's part of succession. Okay, compensation, the payment or the salary of the President of the United States is currently $400,000. You make $400,000 a year to be President of the United States. You get 50% of that salary for the remainder of your life. Okay? What that means is that we are still paying Jimmy Carter, who was president, who got out of office before I was even born.
How much for like every year?
Every year, Jimmy Carter gets paid as part of his retirement as President of the United States. Now, here's the other thing you should understand. President, well, yeah, no wonder we're in debt. Yeah, that is part of it. But here's the other thing you should understand. So have you heard the claim that the Clintons made? With Hillary said that in 2000, when they got out of the office, they were dead broke. Right? And how much do the Clintons have now?
A lot of money.
Like over $300 million.
What? No.
2 kids in college.
Oh, yeah.
Jesus.
Because you can make a boatload of money once you get out. I mean, Hillary Clinton was making $300,000 per speech just as a former Secretary of State. Presidents make even more. Okay? Additionally, presidents get massive funds for like book deals.
Salary is taxed. Isn't it above the minimum?
Yes.
Okay, so this is pre-tax?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they still pay taxes.
I was like, my
What if they get impeached? Do they still get paid?
I have no idea. Nobody's been impeached. Nobody's been kicked out of office. I don't know. That'd be an excellent question.
questions. I represent naked.
And the succession, this comes from the 25th Amendment. You can read this on your own, but we've talked about this. President, Vice President, Speaker, President Pro Tem, Secretary of State, going down the line. Okay, it is the 25th Amendment that goes through all of that. We'll stop there because we're out of time anyways.
We would have 12 minutes.